All right, I'd like to call to order the October 27th, 2025 Mountlake Terrace Planning Commission meeting to order. Would you please take the roll?
Chair Batista.
Here.
Commissioner Stenson.
Present.
Commissioner Thompson.
Here.
Commissioner Wu.
Present.
Commissioner Morgan.
Here.
Vice Chair Betcher is asked to be excused from tonight's meeting.
Would anybody like to make a motion to excuse Commissioner Betcher?
I make a motion that we excuse Commissioner Vice Chair Betcher from tonight's meeting.
All right, I have a motion.
Second.
Do I have a second?
Seconded.
All right, I have a motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
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 Hearing none, that motion carries. Commissioner Betcher has an excused absence tonight. And then also let the record show that Commissioner Landis has had his child, or I guess his wife has had their next child, so he has officially resigned from the Planning Commission now. So I'm sure we'll get an update on when his position will be filled. All right, item number 3, approval of the October 13th, 2025 meeting minutes. Does anybody have any changes or corrections to those?
No.
All right, hearing none, we'll go and declare those accepted as presented. Item number 4, public comment. Let the record show that there is no public in person tonight. Did we have anybody who has signed up to make public comment online or submitted any kind of online documents?
No one has signed up. However, I do see someone in attendance. Guest, are you here to make a public comment?
I guess we should clarify if it's for something that's on the agenda or something that's not on the agenda.
They are not responding.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on then. Item number 5, public hearing on the draft critical area ordinance.
Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Pizzo. I'm the senior planner here, and I will be going over the critical area ordinance update for tonight's public hearing. So the purpose of my presentation today will be to respond to questions and concerns from the work session that was October 13th, to review the specific code changes proposed by staff, have the public hearing, and have Planning Commission make a recommendation to City Council and discuss next steps. So the critical area ordinance update relates to council goals around environmental sustainability and resiliency. The Growth Management Act requires all cities and counties in Washington to adopt and regularly update their development regulations to protect critical areas. Doing so also aligns with our environmental element of the comprehensive plan, and updates are required to be adopted by the end of this year. And there's 5 different types of critical areas that we regulate: wetlands, critical aquifer, recharge areas, frequently flooded areas, geologically hazardous areas, and fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas. And we also do this work because it can be costly or impossible to replace critical area functions and values once they are lost. Here is an image of our critical area indicator map. So it shows us where there may be critical areas within the city and where regulations apply. There could be critical areas that are not mapped but observed on a site, in which case the regulations apply to those areas as well. Or there may be areas that are mapped but aren't actually critical areas. So this is just an indicator that helps us do further site studies and investigation to see how our regulations apply. Here's the land use map. There were some questions last time about where our critical areas are in relation to our land uses. So I've added the land use map, try to overlay them. It's a lot to look at, but you can kind of see there where the critical areas are and which land uses they overlap with. Also a side-by-side comparison in case that's easier visually to see. And I'll talk more about this in detail in response to some questions that came up last time. So one of those questions was how our critical areas impact the higher density and commercial development areas within the city. And there's definitely some overlap with these areas, but overall critical areas are within our parks and residential areas. And so this map shows our commercial and higher density areas in purple for town center, red for general commercial, purple, light purple for neighborhood mixed use, blue for gateway mixed use, and gray for employment. And I have that kind of zoomed in here. So you can see that the employment district contains some critical aquifer recharge areas, geohazard areas, fish and wildlife conservation areas, as well as frequently flooded areas. And then the gateway mixed use has some geohazards, some fish and wildlife conservation areas, McGallagher Creek notably, and then frequently flooded areas and wetlands. That's down by Van Rye. And then neighborhood mixed use that contains some geohazards, some fish and wildlife conservation areas, and then town center has a little bit of geohazard areas. So some general provision updates in applicability. We've increased the distance from a stream, wetland, or other water body to 300 feet to be consistent with GMA requirements. Also, we previously or currently don't have any provisions related to critical aquifer recharge areas, so adding in a distance equal to or less than 200 feet from these areas to be consistent with GMA requirements is proposed. And then when it comes to exempt activities, we currently have a provision for functionally isolated wetlands or stream buffers, and we're making minor changes or proposing minor changes to provide clarity on what that means with some examples just for the sake of clarity. Also in exempt activities, currently the code states that critical areas cannot alter the location or dimensions, even for minor conservation enhancement, and propose changing that language to net ecological gain so that we're not unintentionally limiting beneficial actions like making a critical area buffer larger, for example. Also within exempt activities, there's no mention of noxious weeds and invasive vegetation, so just adding that in to reflect what is currently in the code within the trees and vegetation section. Also within exempt activities, there's provisions for tree removals and vague language for who the qualified professional is. And so adding in prioritizing conversion to snags and protecting nearby trees and vegetation, and then being more specific that an arborist is the appropriate professional to make those determinations. And that was recommended by the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And then also within exempt activities, there's no requirements to buffer around an affected right-of-way or to retain vegetation or replant disturbed areas. So we're proposing to add a requirement around that as it's a best practice recommended by Facet, our consultant, who helped us immensely with our critical area ordinance update. And then non-conformances, we don't currently have any language specific to critical areas, so we're proposing adding that in. And that will be a new section that deems legal uses and existing structures that are in existence on the effective date of the ordinance as legal nonconforming, as well as applications that have been vested before the ordinance has been adopted. It will also include structures and uses that are being maintained or repaired as long as the impervious area footprint is not increasing. Will also include uses and structures damaged or destroyed by fire, allowing them to be restored and resumed unless they've been abandoned for 6 continuous months. Lawns can be mowed and maintained but not expanded, and non-native vegetation similarly can be maintained but not expanded. Some additional general provisions within the trees and vegetation section. Currently, we don't allow, again, the altering of the size or dimension, but again, switching that language to demonstration of net ecological gain being required. And then there's currently language that limits the removal of noxious weeds and invasive vegetation to hand labor, and that could really limit the types of tools that can be used in effective restoration. So removing that specific requirement. And then there's no timeline currently for when areas cleared of noxious weeds and invasive plants need to be replanted to stabilize soil. So recommending replanting within 60 days unless approved by director to coincide with the planting season. And then provision of hazards for hazard trees is within our healthy trees section, so reorganizing that for clarity. And then currently we have a mitigation ratio of 10:1 for tree replacement with no fee in lieu option. So we're proposing adding a fee in lieu option when the site is constrained, because sometimes you can't fit 10 replacement trees for every one removed. And this will just help us recover the impact related to tree replacement mitigation. Within preliminary assessments for critical areas, right now we have 4 different options that staff can kind of result in a determination, but the 4th and the 3rd one are pretty similar. So we're proposing changing this to 3 options to simplify for implementation. As far as the critical area report section go, we want to strengthen the language to require an applicant to demonstrate that the first action they took was to avoid impact altogether. Some more general provision updates. So our mitigation and preferred sequencing, just removing preferred from the title of that so that it doesn't sound optional, and allowing compensatory mitigation when the critical area function and value can be replaced, and prohibiting mitigation in CARAs because we don't want to allow any type of risk to our drinking water, and then also adding a monitoring requirement. As far as signs and fencing goes, right now it's all text-based, so we want to add images and a fencing standard detail so that there's uniformity across the city. Variances currently have some weak code language that allow for deviation from development standards, so we want to strengthen this language to align with the best available science. When it comes to enforcement and penalties, right now there are fines of $1,000 per non-significant tree and $3,000 per significant tree that's unlawfully cleared, cut, or removed or damaged. And the staff is proposing increasing that to fines of $1,500 per inch of diameter breast height of a non-significant tree and $3,000 per inch of a significant tree. And this is to be consistent with our landscaping and development code 19.130 that was recently updated in 2023. Okay, so now for our critical area type specific amendments, starting with wetlands. Here is a map showing where wetlands are indicated within the city. The first proposal is to increase the buffers for standard buffers that don't have minimization measures and habitat corridor. So we're where we propose increasing these by 25 feet and then 20 feet and negative 50 feet for Category 4 wetlands. Also recommended is increasing the buffer width by 50% where there are slopes greater than 30% per ecology's guidance. And then no longer allowing buffer width reductions as that's not supported by best available science or ecology. And last time I got a question about the impact of increasing these buffers. And I just wanted to show the whole table for some context. So overall, the range is not going to change from what's existing. Wetland buffers range from 40 feet to 300 feet wide, depending on the habitat score, the category of wetland, and if minimization measures are proposed. Also, for some reason, existing low habitat score for standard buffers and mitigated buffers were the same amount. So there's no incentive to do minimization measures. So by increasing the buffers here, there will be that incentive. And so it sort of is kind of logical to increase those there. But overall, it's not affecting the range of wetland buffers that we currently have in the code. And here's some examples of minimization measures. For example, lights, noise, stormwater runoff, things like that. And so that's what we mean by that. Also, we received a question last time about why wetlands need wider buffers where there's steep slopes present. And so I posed that question to ecology, and they provided this response. So steep slopes are less effective of removing pollution before they enter the wetland. When there's steep slopes, water moves faster, and that reduces sediment trapping, which is important for pollutant removal. And so when you increase the buffer, that helps improve water quality of the wetland. Other updates to our wetlands section include adding ecology's recommended language that buffers must be vegetated with native plants appropriate to the ecoregion, and if that can't be done, then widen to ensure that functions are provided. Also propose adding a new section of conditions for wetlands with 6 or more habitat score and habitat corridor protection requirements. And this is probably more applicable in larger rural jurisdictions, but just wanting to mirror ecology's recommended language. And then wetlands with 5 or less habitat scores will only require mitigation measures that are listed in Table 2, which I just referenced. And that's consistent with what we have in code now. And then building setbacks from wetland buffers, we propose modifying this to not allow uncovered decks in the setback area to be consistent with our existing code language. So only building overhangs up to 2 feet and impervious surfaces will be allowed within the building setback. And normal stormwater regulations will apply. And then adding exemptions for legal nonconforming. We're also looking to tighten up our regulations so that alterations to any wetland is allowed through a variance or reasonable use exception, not an administrative approval process. And when a hearing examiner does allow for an alteration, compensatory mitigation is required. So that can look like mitigation ratio, wetland ratios, or alternative types based on the trade-offs through best available science, or the credit debit method, which really brings back functions and values into the ratio calculation. Right, within our fish and wildlife conservation areas, there was a question last time about if streams and slopes have a similar relationship as wetlands and slopes in terms of regulating them with wider buffers where there's slopes. And fish and wildlife does not have a specific numeric standard the way ecology does for where slopes are present, but the same scientific principle applies. So steeper slopes accelerate runoff and erosion and can increase the sediment in the water in the streams. So wider buffers help maintain water quality. However, staff is recommending keeping the stream buffer regulations as originally proposed. Fish and Wildlife did already provide a letter of support without increased stream buffers for slopes, and our current and proposed regulations do say that the buffers are minimums and can be increased based on site-specific conditions. So staff feels that taking a site-specific approach can help us balance other GMA goals like housing with environmental protection goals like through our critical area ordinance. Some general updates to our fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas is moving the stream section that was standalone into this section, updating our definition for fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas, updating classifications for these areas to be consistent with state law and ensure that implementation is practical. So removing primary and secondary so that we only have one category. We propose adding language to retain city's authority to determine buffers, adding a provision to exempt functionally disconnected buffers, not permitting alterations without a reasonable use or variance, and the mitigation plan should be implemented before the areas are disturbed or immediately after, and time to reduce impacts to plants and animals. And then maintenance and monitoring is now required, which is required in every other type of critical area, so just being consistent with that. So there were two approaches for streams that the city could take. So the first is the Department of Natural Resources water typing system. This is what our code currently uses. It's based on flow volume, fish use, accessibility, seasonality, and presence of salmonids. The second option would be the site potential tree height model and riparian management zones. And this is the new best available science put out by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And in this method, all streams have equal importance and protection is based on soil types and associated dominant tree species. So Facet helped us with a comparison of both of these approaches, and then including retaining existing buffers. So if we retain those, the pros is it's familiar and predictable. We know how to do it. That's how we've been doing it. The cons is that it's not consistent with Fish and Wildlife's guidance. It would underprotect streams and fall short of ecological function targets. And our current regulations impact 228 parcels. The next option we could consider is a minor change, so increasing those buffers by 25 feet, and that would improve habitat function for type N streams. It moves us in the right direction, but it's still below our site potential tree height average of 173 and could underprotect these areas. This would impact 280 parcels, not considering the 10-foot building setback. The moderate change, which is what staff is proposing, would increase buffers for type F to 150 feet and type N to 100 feet. And this will provide high ecological function across all stream types. It more closely aligns with the site potential tree height averages and retains the stream classification method that we currently have. It will impact 340 parcels, not including building setback. And then lastly is the major change option, which is the full site potential tree height. It would give all streams a minimum of 102 feet, maximum of 231 foot buffers. And this does align with Fish and Wildlife's recommendation, but it would require extensive mapping and review and be difficult to implement. It would impact 409 parcels and limit infill redevelopment as mandated by the Growth Management Act. And so there was a lot of questions about these different options and wanting to see them visually within the city, and also how impervious surfaces overlap with these various options, because there is exemptions for where we currently have development in impervious surface. So under our current buffers, which is the thin black line on the map, that impacts 128 parcels, 126 acres, and has an impervious surface coverage of 13.4% within these areas. And just as a reminder, these buffers are not supported by Fish and Wildlife. Same information on this slide, just showing the zoning map underneath. So you can see mostly within our parks, residential areas, and LIOP, as well as our gateway mixed use land uses. Our minor change option has 39% impervious surface coverage, shown here. Again, these buffer sizes are not supported by Fish and Wildlife. And here they're shown over the land use map. Pretty much the same land uses are affected, but you can see that increase there as 167 acres are affected. And then this is the option staff is recommending 150 feet for type F and 100 feet for type N. There's 44% impervious coverage in these areas. And then this is it shown with the land use underneath. And then just a note on all of this, also the impervious coverage data is not necessarily complete or 100% accurate. It does include streets and parking lots, but might not include all sidewalks or driveways or patios. But it's just to give you all a general sense based on the data that we had. And then lastly, the site potential tree height area. That's the red outline on our largest buffers, which are supported by Fish and Wildlife, have an 18% impervious cover within those buffer areas. And there, again, with the land use map, again, affecting similarly designated areas. So as I mentioned, staff recommends the option of increasing fish to 100 feet or 150 feet from 100 feet, and then type N streams to 100 feet from 50 feet, or determined based on technical review. And then the shoreline stuff we are taking out of critical areas, as that's covered by our shoreline regulations. Other recommended updates to Fish and Wildlife habitat conservation areas is to allow overhangs and impervious surfaces in the building setback consistent with our wetland buffer standards. We're improving how to identify the stream buffer edge. We're requiring stream buffers to be vegetated with native plants or increasing buffer widths. We're providing exemptions for functionally isolated buffers, for legal nonconforming established buffers with conditions. We're requiring the enhancement measures for development and redevelopment, which is currently only optional. And then buffer averaging for streams will no longer be allowed to prevent a net loss of ecological function. And we're removing a provision which currently allows for buffer reductions based on economic viability for commercial redevelopment. Next is the geologically hazardous areas shown on the map here. Proposed updates include classification definitions, updating our landslide hazard susceptibility factors to be consistent with state law, adding a slope delineation program to help with implementation and clarity, requiring a cumulative impact assessment as part of the hazard analysis within a critical area report, And then requiring an analysis of dynamic conditions to provide a factor of safety thresholds and prohibiting safety from decreasing on a site or adjacent properties. The next area is frequently flooded areas, shown in the light blue on the map. And changes that are proposed include adding a habitat assessment requirement when there are projects within the floodplains, so that we can understand potential effects on endangered species. Flood storage volumes cannot be decreased by a project, and flood base elevations cannot be increased by a project. CARAs are our next type of critical area, or critical aquifer recharge areas as shown on the map here. And here you can see it with the land use map. So CARAs are located within our 1, 2, and 3 residential land use designations, as well as our LIOP zone or employment designation, as well as REC. So proposed changes include updating our classification to be based on susceptibility rather than significance, including wellhead protection areas as a type of CARA, adding CARAs to the critical area map, listing uses that are regulated and prohibited in these areas, updating our standards and criteria for alteration or development within a CARA, and then updating our report requirements so that a hydrogeologic report is done by a geologist with licensing in hydrogeology, because currently it just says a geologist, and Department of Health gave us that comment. And then requiring critical area reports to include wellhead protection information where that's present. And the mitigation planning section is proposed as being removed because no degree of degradation is allowed within aquifers, as that's directly related to drinking water. And then within our definition section, just updated that to remove terms that aren't in the critical area ordinance anymore, adding new words and phrases that are, and updating definitions to meet best available science or state law definitions. And then last time we received a question about concerns with updated regulations affecting the staff workload and how implementation would affect staff capacity. Short answer is that the ordinance updates are required by state law. As I mentioned last time, the city can hire a third party to support with permit reviews. And over time, we'll monitor any increase in the workload resulting from these new regulations and determine as time goes on if changes in staffing is needed. So we are within our Commerce 60-day review and SEPA comment period. DNR, Department of Natural Resources, did comment on our geologically hazardous areas since we last met. So they suggested reviewing references to qualified professional, making sure that's clear what that means for geological hazards. They had a lot of words of support regarding our current regulations, and then did ask us to consider referencing the Geologic Information Portal as a best available science resource, which is some map layers. So we're looking into that. And then supporting detailed geotechnical report requirements, adding the factor of safety, which I mentioned on those slides. And so I was able to incorporate their comments and have included those in the draft ordinance that you have before you. And then we received, like I mentioned, the letter of support from Fish and Wildlife on the draft ordinance, including the stream buffer options that staff recommends. And then no other official comments have been received to date, though I will mention we've been working with Department of Health as well on our CARA regulations. So the next steps is for staff to forward the Planning Commission's recommendation to City Council following the public hearing tonight. Council will have a work session on the ordinance on December 11th, and the public hearing on the ordinance and vote on the adoption of the ordinance on December 18th. Okay, and now we have time for discussion and questions. Thank you.
Do any of the planning commissioners have any questions for staff? Commissioner Wu?
Yeah. Thanks for the presentation. That was really comprehensive. Appreciate it. So first, just a technical or maybe mechanical note. The impervious areas exhibition, when we were showing the table for the impervious areas, like just the percentage, I just noted a mechanical error in that those percentages should not be additive. So at any rate, may want to make a correction there. I'm not sure that really impacts the analysis, as it looks like each was kind of impacted similarly in that all tables added them.
I see.
Yeah, but probably should apply a little bit more of like some product type of formula instead. Also, I had a question in a different area. It was in the section about tree replacement, and we were discussing the support for the, or there was a fee in lieu of, and supportive of that. And I think that my question is more along the original requirement of 10-to-1 on tree replacement. That seems a little bit excessive to me, in that may not even be ecologically sound. Just kind of relating to my own experience with just my own garden, putting too many trees and plants close together, they don't grow well. So to the extent that we may want to review that, I just want to call that out as a note that stuck out to me as something that might be counterproductive. But that's separate than the staff recommendation of the fee in lieu of. I am supportive of that because I do think you'll run into that a lot, but I'm questioning the original requirement to begin with.
Yeah, so that's kind of why I went back to address this, because in between, since I was here last, I had a staff person who works for Parks who's doing a project and has to replace trees, saying that it might be hard to find enough space for a 10-to-1 replacement, which is a fair point, and something we see also with private development requirements. And so the code does say, and we won't be changing this, that if for some reason, like the tree survival rate, or if it does more harm to the critical area to perhaps overcrowd it with trees, then we wouldn't require the 10-to-1 ratio. It's kind of just the starting point, but through an arborist recommendation, it could be less to get at exactly the point you are making and my coworker is making, and what we've seen as planners doing private development review. So I think that adding the fee in lieu option will help us be consistent with elsewhere in our code where we talk about tree replacement, and allow us to recover kind of the impact of trees being removed, but wanted to leave the 10-to-1 ratio with the understanding that it could be less, but then we would recover kind of the fee in lieu costs. So I'm not sure if that addresses your question, but it was something that kind of came up and was like, oh yeah, we've experienced this in development review too. Let's kind of look at that again and see what we can do, or what it currently says around that.
Yeah, I appreciate that the discussion's happening. I think it's a good one to have. I think part of the kind of core issue of why I may view it like somewhat problematic is that you could imagine if the requirement was even more onerous. Let's say it was something ridiculous like 50-to-1, but if you can't meet that, we'll have a fee in lieu. So it sounds like in that case, 100% of sites would be paying a fee in lieu. So just kind of in the spirit of what is the fee really replacing? If it's something objectively achievable and reasonable, by all means. So it's kind of it's tough because it's a question of like magnitude and degree, which is always kind of subjective, and there's fringes of what's fair and unfair. But yeah, I just wanted to express that point of it. No recommendation on what that magic number really is, but just expressing the reasons why I may be concerned about a fee associated with a requirement that may or may not be reasonable.
Okay. I mean, if you do have a recommendation of a different ratio and Planning Commission wants to kind of discuss that and come to an agreement on what that might be, you know, that could be something that is a recommended change that I bring to council. So if you have any input on what that number might be and want to have a discussion, I just want to welcome
Sure.
that.
I mean, I could definitely throw out a number that maybe like, you know, I'm no expert in this, but gut shot, even replacing like, you know, kind of native or, you know, reasonably sized trees, even 3 or 4 to 1 is like that's a lot, you know, in terms of a pretty healthy replacement number. So I would say if we do make this recommendation, it would be nice if it's supported by some sort of best practice rationale that we could all agree on.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But if you told me, you know, pick a number, you have to, I would, my mind lands at like 3 to 1 or 4 to 1.
Okay.
Yeah,
you.
Commissioner Wu does make a good point about best practice, because it depends on the where too, right? Where you're doing this replacement. Some places are going to be more conducive to a greater quantity of trees, and others will not. But 10 to 1 does sound like a lot. Just about anywhere, even if it was a park or a wooded area, that sounds like a lot. And thank you for catching that.
Commissioner Wu, your hand is still up. I just want to make sure that you didn't have anything else. Okay.
Oh, no, sorry. I appreciate the discussion around the question.
I guess my follow-up to that would be, you had mentioned if it's not 10 to 1, you know, to examine whether or not 10 to 1 is feasible, it would be an arborist. Would that be the city arborist or an independent arborist, or would it be the developer's paid arborist?
Well, the city does not have like a paid staff arborist, so it would be the applicant's arborist. If staff feels like they want to have a third-party arborist review the applicant's report, we could. We have on-call arborists that we could, you know, have review the site, the proposal, to verify that the applicant's arborist report is in line with the best practice recommendation. But we don't have one on staff, so the first course of action would be relying on the applicant's arborist report.
Okay. I'm assuming, you know, when the arborist submits a report, you know, they're under the same obligations, like if it's an engineered stamp plans, you know, they're hired by the applicant, but they have to still follow certain practices and professional ethics. I feel that there's always a potential for conflict of interest when it's the, you know, applicant bringing in somebody they hired to give a recommendation that can or cannot benefit the applicant. I guess my other follow-up to that would be, if the 10 to 1 can't be satisfied within the critical area, could the city still require it on the remainder of the parcel?
I think the arborist report should address the entire site and make a determination if the trees can be planted else. Oh, I see. You mean if a site doesn't, or is partial critical area, partial not critical area, could it
Which a
go
lot
in
of
the
our sites are.
non-critical area?
Yeah.
I don't know that the code is that specific as to, that it really addresses that. I think it's assumed that it's all within the critical area portion, but that's kind of a good question or a good point to consider. Could it just be on site, but not within the critical area if the arborist determines that it would be detrimental to put that many trees within the critical area? I feel like because the code doesn't specifically prohibit it, if that's something the arborist recommended, staff could consider and approve that. But yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah. And again, with the 10-to-1, was that, can you remind me again, was that sort of standard practice for replacement? Was there a specific?
That's what our code currently has.
So this would be consistent with other portions of our code?
Yes, so this is just adding the fee in lieu to what we currently have, which is 10-to-1 unless an arborist determines otherwise, and the fee in lieu would make up the difference. I think also adding the fee in lieu helps incentivize, like if more trees can go in without being a detriment, then, let's do that. Whereas now it's just like, well, if they can't fit it, then that's okay. I think the fee in lieu just helps kind of add an incentive to do it if that is something that's feasible. Because, I discussed it with Christy, and she was like, let's, recommend leaving in 10-to-1, but adding the fee in lieu consistent with the other part of our code for that reason.
And I know we spend many, many meetings cleaning up our code to make sure all parts of our code are consistent with all other parts of our code. In this case, leaving it 10-to-1, it would be consistent. And we could always go back, and if we discover, yeah, this just clearly isn't working and it needs to be revised, then maybe that could be something that we could address holistically across the code in general and do a simultaneous update so we maintain that consistency.
Yeah, absolutely. The code can be changed anytime through the process. I will say the 10-to-1 is specific to critical areas, and really just mentioned there. The consistency with the other codes is about adding in the fee in lieu to be consistent with what we have. So, replacement in the landscape code is based on how many significant trees of a certain type, and it breaks it down based on their size. 10-to-1 is really specific to critical areas. I think because these are the areas that have more trees, it's more of a function and value thing.
During sort of the research and formulation process of creating, this update, did you or the consultant come across examples from other jurisdictions that use a different ratio?
I did not look into that. This was kind of a last minute, like, oh yeah, the 10-to-1 ratio has presented some issues that's come up in the last week. So the consultant didn't say anything about it being too low or too high. They didn't really comment on it when they did their initial review. And then, I hadn't compared it to other jurisdictions, but that is something that I could do and come back if that was desired. So, or could be part of a different update.
Yeah, I mean, to make that kind of change, I know I'd probably want to see a little bit more research on it. How do the other commissioners feel? I guess it's a two-part question. Do you guys feel, yes, you want to see a little bit more info on that before we proceed? Or you're fine with changing the number right now? Or I guess the third option would just be you're fine with leaving it since we can always go back and change it in the future?
This is Commissioner Thompson, I'm fine with leaving it since we can change it in the future. But we'll have to, I think we should try to figure out what it does say in other places or what is feasible when we decide on that change.
And with our, I guess, sort of adding to that, I know we periodically update these codes. Can you tell me kind of what the review cycle is for this?
Every 10 years.
Okay. That's a ways out.
Yeah, I'm like, whoa, 10.
Yeah.
I
But
mean,
obviously,
it can be updated before that, but the state requires minimum every 10 years.
Okay.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, instinctually, I think the number's lower, but in the sake of process and kind of conservatism with the law of what we've already passed, I do think that this is a question of subject matter expertise as far as a recommendation that's aligned with what we want as a city for our critical areas and canopy. So I'm fine also kind of deferring the decision with the idea that we do put some effort in the subject matter area around this.
Okay. And I know I'm comfortable leaving it for now, but obviously if this causes an issue, then open to revisiting it. In this case, we probably won't realize it until we finally start seeing, some development in a lot of these residential critical, that areas that are in the critical areas, we may never see, any kind of proposed redevelopment. So it's kind of my guess is where we're going to see it is more in our mixed use zoning, town center zoning, kind of the areas closer to the light rail station that, are more ripe for redevelopment. So I know I'm comfortable for leaving. So I got 3 for just leaving it for now. Anybody else like to weigh in?
Yeah, I'm just going to throw in, I think this applies to a lot of our decisions, but this seems like a two-way door that we can always come back to. And so as long as it's not a one-way door that's going to close it, we should just keep it moving and keep the city cranking on their other initiatives.
Okay. Anybody else like to weigh in? And just so you guys know, I'm only breaking this down because this will definitely change how we make the motion. So I just want to make sure we're going to get it right. Commissioner Stenson, were you saying something?
Oh, yeah, I thought maybe you couldn't hear me since you started talking. I was just saying that if we can flag it for council and maybe just have our subject matter experts look at some more, then I think it's good to move forward.
Okay. And I think since we're not changing it when the recommendation is forwarded to council, would staff at least bring this point up to them saying, hey, this is something that we discussed. We decided to leave it, but see if council has similar concerns because they obviously can make their own recommendations to change if possible. So.
Sure, and I can compare other jurisdictions' ratios between now and then as well.
Yeah, because it looks like there's probably a couple of weeks before you're taking it to council.
Yes.
Okay, so there'll be time to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Did anybody else have any other questions?
No questions.
Okay, so I'm not hearing or seeing any other questions for staff. So at this point, we can open the public hearing. Would anybody like to make the motion to open the public hearing?
I make a motion that we open the public hearing.
I have a motion to open the public hearing. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a motion and a second to open the public hearing. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Hearing none, that motion carries. The public hearing is now open. And then, again, we can open it one more time for questions for Planning Commissioner of staff. Normally it'd be the applicant, but it's staff, so. All right, not hearing any for that.
No questions. Yeah.
We'll go ahead and move it for public comment. We did see someone. I thought I recognized the name when they popped in as being from the state. So I would say looks like it was Morgan. If Morgan would like to make a public comment, since you are a representative of the state who provided comment on this, I think in this case we can waive the 3-minute period for comment if you'd like to make a comment.
If you wish to make a comment, Morgan, please raise your hand.
Okay, just don't see any indication that they wish to make a public comment. So just double checking, do we have anybody else who's in the meeting right now who maybe would want to?
No one else has signed up to make public comment.
Okay, and there was no additional written testimony that was submitted other than the state's letter?
None.
Okay. All right, with that, I'm looking for a motion to close the public hearing.
I make a motion that we close the public hearing.
I have a motion to close the public hearing. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a motion and a second to close the public hearing. All in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed? Hearing none, that motion carries. Public hearing is now closed. There's one last chance for any planning commission discussion. Does anybody have any additional questions, comments?
No questions.
All right, so normally the vice chair or somebody in person would help with this next part, making the motion for the matter itself. So since I'm by myself here, it's going to need to be somebody who's online. We did email a script to kind of help out with this process. I don't know if you guys have seen your email. Basically, we're just looking for a motion with any technical to approve, unless somebody doesn't want to approve it. I'm assuming the motion would be to approve the critical area ordinance, chapter 16.15, with any technical corrections. So I'm just looking for that motion.
Yes, I'll make a motion to recommend approval of the critical area ordinance as presented to City Council with technical corrections.
All right, I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have an motion and a second to approve the draft critical area ordinance, chapter 16.15, to City Council with any technical corrections. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Hearing none, that motion carries. All right. Looks like we have another public hearing on our docket. So item number 6, public hearing for the draft floodplain management ordinance, chapter 16.18.
Okay, I will be discussing the floodplain management ordinance update for the public hearing. So similar to the critical area ordinance, this will be an opportunity to respond to questions and concerns from Planning Commission's work session on October 13th, review specific code changes, have the public hearing and recommendation to City Council, and discuss next steps. So the council goals are also the environmental sustainability and resiliency goals related to this update, specifically minimizing climate impacts while protecting vulnerable populations and planning for citywide resilience. The National Flood Insurance Program is managed by the federal agency or Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and this program provides flood insurance to property owners, renters, businesses, so that they can recover quicker when floodwaters recede. And the Department of Ecology in Washington State helps jurisdictions adopt and enforce floodplain management regulations. These updates are also required by the end of this year, and updating the requirements aligns with our comprehensive plan. So this is our flood insurance rate map. Mountlake Terrace contains only Zone A of special flood hazard, which are areas with a 1% chance of flooding and 26% chance of flooding over a 30-year mortgage. Last time I received a question about if Mountlake Terrace contains any floodways, and reached out to Department of Ecology, who confirmed that the city actually does not contain floodways, only floodplains. And a floodplain is an area of land susceptible to being flooded or inundated by water from any source. And these are regulated through code, permits, development restrictions, and that's what is shown in the map in blue. Floodways are a different zone. It's a channel of a river or other water course, and the adjacent areas have to be reserved for the discharge of base flood without affecting water surface elevation more than a designated height. And those are called regulatory floodways. Essentially, these are areas with higher velocity of water. Also received a question about how many parcels are impacted by floodplains. And that would be 127 parcels have a floodplain within them in the city. And I was also asked if the city tracks where flooding occurs versus where the map shows it. And the city does not track this due to limited capacity. We really just rely on the FEMA maps to administer the program. And specifically, I-5 and 44th was brought up as an area with flooding, but the flooding has actually been addressed by Sound Transit, so there shouldn't be as much flooding in that location currently. This is the floodplain map on top of the land use map. So floodplains are located mostly in residential districts, the LIOP or employment, land use designation, and recreation and parks. So our proposed updates include updating some definitions, removing water dependent definition as that's no longer in the ordinance, and adding words and phrases that are newly proposed. Within the administration proposed update section, an application for a development permit, clarifying that it must include the proposed elevation of the lowest floor in relation to average sea level, and adding a requirement to provide an engineering analysis that indicates no rise of base flood elevation when the development is proposed in a floodway. However, since Mountlake Terrace doesn't have floodways, this probably won't really be applicable, but it's part of the model ordinance. And then duties and responsibilities of the floodplain administrator will be to review all permits and determine that proposed development is not in the floodway or meets no rise standards. Again, probably not entirely applicable given that we don't have floodways. Also adding that FEMA is notified when annexations occur in the special flood hazard area, and that FEMA is notified of changes to base flood elevation. are all recommended additions. Also within the duties and responsibilities of our floodplain administrator is adding or clarifying that records where the base flood elevation is provided through a flood insurance study or flood insurance rate map, or as required by code, must be obtained and maintained, as well as as-built for the lowest floor in relation to average sea level. And then adding the certification requirements for no rise standards. Also within duties and responsibilities is removing reporting to FEMA any changes to special flood hazard areas, as that is no longer required. When it comes to the review of building permits, adding a provision that where the elevation data is not available through the flood insurance study or flood insurance rate map or another authoritative source, that applications are reviewed to be that the construction is reasonably safe from flooding, and the test of reasonableness will be based on local judgment, including historical data, high water marks, photographs, or past flooding where we have that available. More construction provisions include adding that water wells should be located on high ground, away from the floodway for utilities, and that subdivision and development proposals greater than 50 lots or 50 acres, whichever is less, include the base flood elevation as part of the application. More construction provisions include specific standards for residential and non-residential construction. So adding that where the base flood elevation has been determined or obtained, new construction shall have a lowest floor, including the basement, elevated 1 foot above the base flood elevation, and any mechanical equipment or utilities must be waterproofed or elevated at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. Specific standards for non-residential construction. If the base flood elevation cannot be obtained, structure's lowest floor must be 2 feet above the highest adjacent grade. Also, fully enclosed areas below the lowest floor have to be designed to allow entry and exit of flood waters and designed by a professional engineer or architect. Alternatively, engineered openings are allowed. And if the above is not met, the building must be structurally flood-proofed, and insurance premiums are based on rates that are 1 foot below the flood-proof level. And then adding a specific standards that if buildings or manufactured homes are constructed or substantially improved with fully enclosed areas below the lowest floor, they can only be used for parking of vehicles, building access, or storage. So the Commerce 60-day review and SEPA on this ordinance has ended and no comments have been received. The next steps include staff forwarding Planning Commission's recommendation to City Council following the public hearing and the same dates as the critical area ordinance of December 11th and December 18th for the work session and public hearing. Now we have time for discussion and questions.
Okay, do any commissioners have any questions for staff?
No questions, just a comment. I'm glad that that 44th Street waterway has been fixed. I wonder what it looks like over the weekend.
I'm highly skeptical that they'll ever be able to fix that. That area has been a problem for decades.
I mean, it is pretty low, isn't it?
Yeah, multiple times they've said, "Oh, we fixed it," and it's
I haven't seen it,
not fixed.
so I don't know. But
Yeah, it's very complicated. Why that original development there was ever allowed to be built, I don't know. But it's not our jurisdiction, so base of the hill, that's unincorporated. So I am not hearing or seeing any indication that there's any questions for staff. Just giving it one more chance here. All right, so go ahead and looking for a motion to open the public hearing.
I make a motion that we open the public hearing.
I have a motion to open the public hearing. Is there a second?
Motion seconded.
All right, I have a motion and a second to open the public hearing. All in favor say aye.
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 Opposed?
Aye.
All right, hearing no opposition, go ahead and declare the public hearing is now open. Again, one last chance. Do any planning commissioners have any questions for staff? Not hearing or seeing any, so then we'll go ahead and move on to see if there's any public comment. Anybody online wishes to make a public comment?
There is no one currently online.
Okay. That'll make that quick. So then I'm looking for a motion to close the public hearing.
Motion to close the public hearing.
I have a motion to close the public hearing. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a motion and a second to close the public hearing. All in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Hearing none, the public hearing is now closed. One last chance. Any planning commissioner discussion? I'm not hearing or seeing any, so at this point, I'm looking for a motion to approve the draft floodplain management ordinance, chapter 16.18, with any technical corrections for that recommendation to City Council. So, just looking for that motion.
Making a motion to recommend the approval of the floodplain management ordinance as presented to City Council with any and all technical corrections.
Okay, I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, I have a motion and a second to approve the draft floodplain management ordinance, chapter 16.18 to City Council. All in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? All right, not hearing anybody opposed, we'll go ahead and declare the motion passed to recommend to City Council. Thank you very much, staff, on this one too. I know the two of these together was a lot of work for you.
Agreed. Thank you for all the good hard work.
All right, so looks like we're ready to move on to the next item on the agenda, item number 7. It's the review draft housing action plan.
Good evening, everyone. So we're back to talk about the full housing action plan, the draft of which you should have seen earlier this week in your packet. So just a brief overview of what I'll be talking about tonight, since these are topics that we've had a lot of conversations about. So I'll just do a brief overview of the housing action plan, including what's in it and kind of a broad overview of each section. And then we'll go over the housing action plan actions as they are now. There have been a few updates since the last time that we talked based on your feedback. And then we'll discuss if there's any feedback, questions, comments that you all have, and then talk about next steps. But just so we all, looking forward, the next step will be a public hearing in 2 weeks on the 10th. So again, tonight's content will be pretty similar to what we talked about last time. Last time we did a high-level overview of actions and implementation categories, and we heard that there was generally support for the draft actions, and then there were a few updates to priorities for implementation. And so the actions, as you will see tonight, reflect those changes. The Housing Action Plan, it's the same categories, but there are refined, again, the implementation categories are a little bit updated, and then there's refined and additional information about each action provided in the plan. So the overview of the Housing Action Plan, there are 3 main sections and then a number of appendices. So there's a section on the context for the Housing Action Plan and the process that we went through to produce it. There's a section on summarizing housing needs and opportunities. There are obviously the actions. And then for the appendices, there's a summary of the comprehensive plan information that we relied on, a summary of our community engagement, our development feasibility analysis findings, and then a crosswalk of the Housing Action Plan actions and the housing element policies. So just briefly summarizing what's in that Housing Action Plan context, basically talks about the purpose, which is to translate the housing element into a set of concrete actions, including identifying steps the city can take to increase housing options and affordability, building on recent zoning updates and ongoing work to provide consistency between policy direction and implementation, identifying programs, partnerships, and strategies to support housing stability and choice, and helping the city make informed decisions about what to implement first based on feasibility, capacity, and community priorities. And so these are the priorities and the housing needs that, based on our conversations together, our conversations with the community and developers, and a review of the existing analyses that you all have worked on, including in the comprehensive plan, we found that there are a few policy priorities that emerged. Those were supporting housing production, investing in centers, incentivizing affordable units, increasing housing diversity, and preventing displacement. And so we used these priorities to help us organize the actions into those implementation timeframes that we talked about, including those that have the greatest potential for near-term implementation. So in the Housing Action Plan, there are tables that have just a summary of each action, which reflect what you'll see here tonight. And then each action also has an additional detailed sheet that has the implementation timeframe, action type, staff capacity that would be needed for implementation and maintenance, the rationale for the action, supporting housing element policies, the current policy or process, implementation considerations, and then any additional context that might be relevant, including data, legislation, engagement themes, or analysis findings. So this is an example of one of the actions on the right. And so I'll quickly go over the Housing Action Plan actions. We talked about these last time, so I won't spend too long on each one. But if you do have any questions, we can definitely go back and talk about any of the specific actions after we get through this. So the actions that are completed, you all have updated the zoning and design standards in residential zones. Part of that update was offering density bonuses for environmentally sustainable building practices. And as part of the comprehensive plan, you reviewed and updated the land use regulations to provide increased residential capacity. The things that you all and staff are currently working on are updating the permit forms to reflect recently updated allowances in those residential zones, simplifying the ADU permitting requirements to a building permit only process, updating impact fee assessments, updating development regulations for zones in the gateway and neighborhood mixed use land use areas, and developing educational materials on the development process, including guidance for permits, building considerations, and financing to help especially smaller developers or residents that don't have much development experience feel more comfortable with the process. These are the actions that you all identified as priorities for near-term actions.
Those are reviewing and updating the sub-area plans to reflect the comprehensive plan designations, reviewing the town center zoning and design standards and considering adjustments as needed, reviewing and updating mobile home park standards to remove barriers to replacing and updating older units, updating permitted use tables for permanent supportive housing and emergency housing to help align with state legislative requirements, clarifying regulations and definitions for small and alternative housing types, adopting building code amendments both to reduce barriers to home repair and rehabilitation, but also building code amendments that could support more effective building practices, including upcoming 2026 updates for multifamily and middle housing. Also for middle housing, simplifying the permit review process to be more intuitive for homeowners and reduce development time and costs, as well as amending the permit review process for projects that have income-restricted affordable housing units. And finally, considering offering a property tax exemption for ADUs rented to low-income households as defined as below 60% AMI. In the midterm, we have waiving or reducing impact fees for affordable housing, adopting density bonuses for income-restricted housing in gateway and neighborhood mixed-use zones, and expanding tenant protection strategies, and then a number of options surrounding MFTE. Those include adopting a 12-year MFTE program in R2, adopting an 8-year and a 12-year MFTE program in R3, expanding the 12-year town center MFTE program to the gateway and neighborhood mixed-use zones, and continuing to offer MFTE in town center, but considering phasing out the 8-year option to only offer the 12-year program. The long-term actions that we have that definitely take more resources, more time to pull together, but also can have a broad, higher impact. Those are encouraging affordable home ownership units developed through the middle housing density bonus or through MFTE to be stewarded by a community land trust, surveying the city's existing real estate holdings and considering transferring property or providing a long-term lease to a mission-driven developer, strategically targeting public investments to add amenities like sidewalks or parks, or improving infrastructure to incentivize development near transit and amenities, and pursuing funding for infrastructure improvements such as utility upgrades that could improve feasibility for mission-driven organizations to acquire and preserve at-risk affordable housing. And then the final category is things that are ongoing. These are actually all the actions, it's not just partnerships. Those actions are continuing to participate in regional housing efforts, proactively engaging Snohomish County to clarify plans for distributing affordable housing funding, supporting applications for public affordable housing funds for projects that align with city priorities, pursuing opportunities to support development on properties owned by religious organizations, and establishing relationships with community land trusts, hosting educational community workshops that would provide space for participants to ask questions and receive direct support about the development process, providing assistance as well, just at the counter, for navigating permitting procedures and requirements, supporting opportunities to purchase manufactured home communities if they go up for sale, enforcing maintenance of investment properties to disincentivize vacant and or deteriorating buildings, particularly in town center. And then when the city is providing public comment on proposed legislation, advocating for expanded opportunities for home ownership, particularly through condominiums. And then finally, monitoring both land capacity and development trends, as well as regulated and naturally occurring affordable housing units that might be at risk of redevelopment. And so with that, I'll just briefly go over next steps since it's short and then we can have discussion. But like I said, the next time that you see me, we'll be talking at the public hearing that's in a couple weeks on the 10th. We are meeting with City Council to have their work session later that week, and then their public hearing will be in early December. And so with that, would love to hear if you have any questions or comments or feedback on the Housing Action Plan draft. I'm happy to also go back and spend a little bit more time on any actions or pieces that you'd like to hear more detail about.
Commissioner Wu?
Yeah. Good to see you again. General question on, I guess, problem identification and problem statements. So a lot of the housing action plan, I feel like, has been focused on the range of solutions that are possible, certainly in furtherance of the objective of what was stated with respect to increasing housing options, diversity, displacement, prevention, et cetera. But I think that there's like a degree of problem statement missing that makes me unsure of whether a solution is effective and what the solution even is to what problem. And again, I understand that it's in the vein of improving access to housing in a variety of ways, but I don't feel like I have a good sense of like the root cause of anything that we're trying to solve here. So just generally, that would be useful, I guess, in the prioritization exercise. We've gone down a path where, obviously we can't redefine everything, but just in terms of the explicit requests of, prioritization, it would be helpful to know what's like the most acute problem statements that we have, and what are the most acute problems we have.
Okay, can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
Is that feedback generally across like the entire framing of the housing action plan, or more like you're interested in action by action, what kind of that logic is? Or both?
More so the former, with my direct feedback. I think that any individual plan we can tactically address, but as far as the larger exercise of prioritization, there's probably no city that's flush on resources, and we're being asked to prioritize all of these things in sequence of like short to long. And I think that we can make some progress on that, but again, like I feel like I don't have enough like clues or information as far as like problem observations and root causes to really be effective in making like a sensible recommendation on the order of operations of solutions.
Okay, noted, thank you. That's helpful.
Is that information that you're able to kind of expand on, or now? Or?
I think, yes. I think the way that we thought about it is, looking at things like policy updates that are relatively low-hanging fruit that don't require a lot of resources to accomplish, and those are things that we put closer to the near term. But also, and I realize that these are broad categories, and we can definitely expand on these a little bit in the next draft of the housing action plan. But the things that we heard were that process improvements can be helpful, that affordable housing is an acute need, but also requires kind of a confluence of factors, from financing to policy to interested developers to come together. And so basically like priming for any projects that might have those factors come together so that you're ready when that happens. Thinking about ways that we can kind of, even at the margins, increase feasibility, especially around the housing types that the community kind of identified as important to them, things like middle housing and ADUs. And so that's kind of where the like updating the permit processes and looking at impact fees, those types of things come in. But really in conversations with staff as well, and obviously Christy's not here tonight, but in conversations with her and her team, looking at what do staff have the capacity to work on over the next year? How can we balance that with having, kind of addressing like the lower hanging fruit types of actions? Because, they could spend the next year working on these long-term actions, but there wouldn't necessarily be an outcome at the end of the year. That's the longer term, more resource intensive actions. It's a little bit at a time working towards a larger impact versus like, yes, we can update this one code section and we can do that relatively quickly. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think that it makes a lot of sense to attack low hanging fruit, and I think that some of the problem statements that you're saying that these recommendations are based off of, I fully believe that there's good conviction that the staff probably has in saying like, hey, this is a problem across the city. Maybe just bringing to light a couple of those as kind of an anchor problem to orient solutions around would be helpful for this specific exercise. So I'm not really questioning like, what we're attacking here. It's more like, could we get some direction from the staff and city's perspective of, top X problems in short term, medium term that we're observing that some of the low hanging fruit stuff may address, may not address, but totally understood on why low hanging fruit is attacked. But then for other things that are not low hanging fruit that require prioritization and capacity and sacrifices against other things, it would be good to know like more of a direct problem statement so we can say, what makes sense to prioritize.
I see, thank you. Yeah, I think in particular between the midterm and the long-term actions, you have an existing MFTE program, and so that is something that could be expanded without having to stand up a whole new program, and it would help meet some of the problems that staff and the community have identified, primarily being workforce housing and affordable housing, both kind of at the lower end of the income spectrum, under 30% AMI, but also 60 to 80% AMI. That's a pretty consistent need that's been identified, and so MFTE is targeted kind of at that income level. There's also pieces with MFTE around potentially getting affordable home ownership units and opportunities, and then also potentially incentivizing other public benefits like accessibility. And so the suite of benefits or public benefits possible with that program, also considering that the program would be expanded, not necessarily a new program, that's kind of how those ended up in midterm versus the long term, which is more, the city would have to, like, for example, thinking about donating land, you'd have to inventory all of the land that the city currently has, its real estate holdings, have a lot of conversations about the purpose for that land, and if there is interest and consensus around how that land might be used, there's finding a developer that's ready to develop on that land, and do a project that really aligns with the city's goals. Like there's a lot of steps that would need to go into it. And so like while the under 30% AMI affordable housing, yes, that is also a critical need that the city has. It's not necessarily as feasible to do earlier rather than later as something like expanding MFTE.
Okay, anybody else have any questions?
No question.
Okay, going once, going twice. All right, doesn't look like we have any other questions at this time. So,
great.
Thank you.
Cool, thank you so much. Again, I'll be back in a couple of weeks. We will send out an updated draft. We can add in some of that framing language that I just kind of talked about into the housing needs and opportunities section, I think is probably the place for it. But we'll send out kind of an updated draft in about a week for you to look over before the public hearing on the 10th.
And I know we've gone over this on previous meetings, so planning commissioners, if something comes to mind that you have a question on, after the fact, feel free to email that to staff, and hopefully they can, incorporate your questions and maybe provide an answer to you, at the next meeting before the public hearing.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you too for the presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, so the next item on the agenda is the director's report. Congratulations, you've been promoted.
There's no director's report. Christie's out, unfortunately.
Okay, just reserve this time. Does planning commissioners have any questions for staff at this time? All
No
right.
question.
Not hearing or seeing any, we'll go ahead and move on to item number 9, miscellaneous business by call of planning commissioners. Anybody have any miscellaneous business? I kind of covered the big one that Commissioner Landis has formally now ended his time with the planning commission, so.
Yeah. Congratulations to him.
All right, again, going once, going twice. All right, not hearing or seeing any, I'll go ahead and declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Good night.